something. It may be scary to look at that chapter and go, how in the world? So I have preached through Nehemiah before, and I have a sermon on Nehemiah 3, but because we're going to have a tough time getting through it, period, you just see names and what they did. And the biggest thing that stands out to me is their teamwork in Nehemiah 3, how each had their assignments, lots of great names for pronunciation, but also I think about, just like when I read the genealogies, somebody in here, this is their name, and so how great it was for them to hear, maybe a grandchild to hear the name of their dad that was in charge of this part of the wall. So this is someone we'll meet in heaven, and there's just a whole bunch of them. So it's not that Nehemiah 3 isn't important, but for time, we're going to go over that and then go to Nehemiah 4 tonight. Nehemiah 4. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported that firefighters in Genoa, Texas, this is a few years back, were accused of deliberately setting wildfires, destructive fires, 40 of them. And when they were caught, they stated this. One of them said, "We had nothing to do. We just wanted to get the red lights flashing and the bells clanging." Hopefully they're former firefighters now. But obviously the job of a firefighter, unless it's a controlled fire, is not to start fires. It's to put them out. And really, the job of Christians isn't to start conflict in churches. It's to try to put it out in the ways that God asks us to, especially in Matthew, how he lines that up. But when we look at Nehemiah 4, the good thing is there's lots of conflict, and also, bad thing, lots of conflict. Good thing is not coming from within. It's coming from without. So it's coming from some of the people that we read about it a few weeks ago. And as you look again at that detailed list of the people who worked on the wall, they had a common goal. They were making progress. And this particular chapter is kind of a miniature of Ruth in that there's at least 5 different scenes in it. So the scene that we're going to see first in verses 1 through 3 is the scene of conflict. And verse 1, Nehemiah records, "Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry," and that word angry means to become hot, "and greatly enraged," which means to be irritated, and he jeered at the Jews. So Nehemiah is painting this very vivid picture of rage boiling inside Mr. Sanballat. Verse 2, "And he said in the presence of his brothers," we have a group now, "and of the army of Samaria." Now we have an army here. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burn ones at that? Tobiah the Ammonite was beside them, and he said, "Yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall." So there's a few threats here. The first is physical, because we have a gang of people now, actually an army, that are gathered here that Sanballat and Tobiah have brought. And even if you're a brave person, when you see an army get ready to possibly be unleashed on you, it gets you a little bit nervous. But then they unleash this psychological warfare. To us, it doesn't sound too bad, but really, if you look at all the different things they're doing here, first of all, they're criticizing the qualities. They say, what are these feeble Jews doing? They mock their motivations. Will they restore the wall for themselves? They ridicule their optimism. Will they offer sacrifices to God? They make fun of their enthusiasm. Will they finish it in a day? They undermine their confidence. Will they revive the stones, or will they bring these stones back to life? And they also magnify the problems. They make them worse. Those heaps of rubbish, sounds very British, or rubble, and burned ones at that. In other words, look how burnt they are. Look how bad things are. These are terrible things. Tobiah is trash-talking the worker, and the way he's doing it is by disrespecting their efforts so far. If someone were to show up on a work day and you're working hard, And someone just says, "You call that weed eating? Is that a painting of a," just starts mocking you. But think about how hard this work is and dangerous the work is. And he throws in at the end of verse 3, if a fox goes up on it, he'll break down that wall. Now, he's exaggerating to make his point. But it's interesting. An archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon did some excavating of Nehemiah's wall a while back, and she found that the walls were 9 feet thick. Now, there were walls thicker than that in that day, but that's fairly thick and pretty sturdy. And it'd have to be, according to what Tobiah is saying here, a fox that was seriously abusing steroids in order to be on that wall and knock it down. So I don't think that was going on then. But they're hoping that they're not only taking the air out of their balloon, but they want to bring that balloon crashing to the ground. So, a good team expects conflict. We don't hope for it, but we know it's going to come, especially in the Lord's work. And Paul makes this real clear in his writings. Just after he meets Jesus, the risen Lord, on the road to Damascus, the person who's going to first disciple him is told by the Lord in Acts 9:16, I will show him how much he must suffer for me. And later in Acts 14:22, Paul says, strengthen the believers by encouraging them to continue in the faith, reminding them that they must enter into the kingdom of God through many tribulations. So what we can learn from that is when we're doing the Lord's work, the Lord's way, you can expect the enemy to fight us. There to be conflict. And as we talked about in Acts 4, 5, and 6, the enemy sometimes will attack by stirring stuff from within, from without. It's coming from every direction. But even though the opposition is intense, God always is giving us the strength we need to get the job we need to do done. So that was the conflict scene. Curtain goes down, comes back up, and in verses 4 through 9, we have the prayer scene. And first of all, notice that the leader is praying. Look at verses 4 and 5. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Verse 5. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. So Nehemiah is praying urgently, but he's also praying honestly. And in our day as Christians, I think if someone were to get up and lead us in public prayer in this way, we might feel, some of us, uncomfortable with it. Especially if it's someone that clearly is God's enemies, even if they are, it's a little hard for us to hear someone say, bring down judgment on their heads and may they be under your judgment and, all these things. Part of it is, in that world, they were more open to dynamic expressions like that, but it's hard not to sound bloodthirsty and gloating when you're doing that. However, if you remember, there's a type of psalms, there's a number of them called imprecatory psalms. What kind of psalms are imprecatory psalms? Anybody have an idea or heard of those things? Those are the psalms, I'll give you an idea. Go to Psalm 69. There's the psalms that people write worship music from. As the deer panteth for the water. And then there are psalms they don't write them from. Let those, verse 6, who hope in you be put to shame, O Lord of hosts. Let not those who seek you be brought to dishonor through me, O God of Israel. He goes on to say, verse 22, let their own table be before them become a snare, and when they are at peace, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened so that they can't see, and make their loins tremble continually. Pour out your indignation upon them, and let your burning... Oh, wow. So if someone gets up and begins to pray that way, Even if we're pretty clear this is someone's enemies, it's a different feeling. But these people were so sure they were doing what God wanted them to do and that He's the only God. So when someone's opposing them, they're opposing God. And that's why Nehemiah prays this way. He's in essence praying that God will be just. And only God knows fully what just is. We have a clear understanding of it at times when we look at His Word, but sometimes what we would call just can be a bit skewed by our bias. And sometimes maybe even someone we call an enemy might be a brother or sister in Christ, and maybe they're not as much at fault as we think they are. But in this case, it's clear-cut. Nehemiah is pronouncing the cost for them if they continue opposing God with all of the horrible things that he hopes happens to them. Because they're trying to say bad things are happening to God's people, he wants them to be turned upon them. And this is where the grace of God dramatically shows up, even in the midst of all this type of prayer for Nehemiah. As we look at the story, like in Ezra 6, that there were others who were initially opposed to God's people in this endeavor that ended up joining them. Ezra 6:21 says this, "The Passover meal was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile," so that's the people we're looking at here in Nehemiah, "and by the others in the land who had turned from their immoral customs to worship the Lord, the God of Israel." So Nehemiah is not saying shut them down. Even if they ask for mercy, don't give it to them. Some people evidently repented and turned away from their evil ways. Verse 6 of Nehemiah 4. "So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work." A great tribute to God's faithfulness and a great tribute to Nehemiah's prayer life. So verse 7, "But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry." Verse 8, "And they plotted together to come in and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion in it." So really, this unholy alliance is surrounding the walls. You have the Samaritans are at the north, the Ammonites, and I'm not pointing to northeast, I don't know where it is. I'm that kind of challenged when it comes to directions like that. Ammonites are on the east, the Arabians are on the south, the men of Ashdod on the west. So they're encircling God's people here, and they're just trying to rattle their cage. A good reason probably they're not attacking them physically is because remember back in chapter 2, verse 9, somebody gave them permission, and he's the king. So if they just go at these people, Artaxerxes could unleash his army upon them. They don't want that. So right now they're trying just to do psyops, psychological warfare with God's people. But not only does Nehemiah pray, look at verse 9, the workers pray. And Nehemiah writes, "And we pray to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night." I like this because it wasn't enough for the leader to pray. You know, sometimes we could think, well, you know, it's easy to ride, if we're not careful, to ride the pastor or the spiritual leader's coattails. And it's nothing wrong with asking the pastor to pray for you, but there's a good opportunity that your prayers may get to God just as quick as his. At our get-togethers as a family sometimes, especially when my mom was living, she always had me pray. And sometimes I'd say, "Mom, there's other people in here that can talk to God just as easily," but that was just her thing. So right now, these people aren't doing that. They're joining Nehemiah and pleading with God. And I think what we can learn, again, is right away when these people are getting conflict, it's coming at them, their first thing they do is pray. They don't start shouting back, insults to the people. They don't take it in their hands and start attacking them. No, they pray. And I like this because the Bible just again and again gives us the realism of the struggles that Christians or believers in God face. Because it can be easy to say, man, you know what? I'm getting this conflict. What is wrong with me? God, it feels like you're punishing me again. And instead of thinking that, maybe we could be thinking, hey, the reason I'm getting this resistance is because I'm serving God, is because I'm trying to walk with Him. So Nehemiah gathering the people together to pray. Prayer is not a convenient way to get rid of life's problems, but it's a loving gift for coping with God's problems, among other things. So scene 1 is conflict. Scene 2 is prayer. Scene 3, discouragement. Verses 10 through 12. A number of years ago, there's a planetarium in New York City called the Hayden Planetarium. And they sent out an invitation to anyone who would be interested in applying to be part of the crew of the first journey to another planet. You hear people talking about, let's go colonize the moon or Mars one day. So 18,000 people applied for this. And they gave the applications to a panel of psychologists. And they looked them over thoroughly and came to the conclusion that in many of the cases, people were applying to go somewhere else and live, thinking they could leave their problems behind on earth, but they would come with them wherever they are. So, verse 10, Nehemiah writes, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves, we won't be able to rebuild this wall. They're getting discouraged. Verse 11, and our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. They're not going to see us coming. Verse 12, at that time the Jews who lived near them came from all directions. And get this, they said to us 10 times, you must return to us. 10 times. So there's 5 different aspects of this discouraging struggle I want us to look at. First of all, look at the extent of the discouragement. In the Hebrew text, it indicates in verse 7 that this was written in like a poetic form. Actually, scholars believe it's translation from a song. So just as when you read a psalm and it says a psalm sung by whatever, we don't get the notes, we don't get to hear them till heaven, but we get the words. And this is, in essence, what some of the scholars have translated this kind of song, and it goes like this. The strength of the burden bearer is drooping. The rubbish heaps so fast. For some reason, I was hearing Gilligan's Island's theme. I thought, I bet that's not it. The rubbish heaps so fast, and we are unable by ourselves to rebuild the wall. It really has the feeling of those old slave spirituals. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. All this, so many beautiful songs came out of the heartache of the slaves. And you've heard them. The spirituals are called. And I think that's kind of in the same vein here. The people of Judah are working so hard, and nobody understands what we're going through but the ones working on the wall. And it's not just the workers who are discouraged. What's important is that the men and the women from the surrounding villages, whose families are under constant threat of attack, they're nervous for their families working on the wall and for themselves. Second, we see the exhaustion of the workers. That expression in verse 10, failing, is from a verb that means to stumble or to stagger. It's a clear picture of an exhausted worker. Now, none of you have ever been exhausted, so you have no idea what that feels like. But, you've started a project and there was glitter and glory, and then after a while it wore off. And now it's just, guts to get through this. And you realize this is going to be hard. And if you're me, you realize you should have read the directions and you did not, and that's wrong. So, they're exhausted, and now they're seeing the size of the job. As the weeks go on, those stones at first, which seemed like a challenge to conquer, now become a chore. All of the rubble that had to be cleaned up it felt like, they were taking a step forward and 3 steps backward. And you're thinking, man, if maybe you've seen some of these funny clips. I saw this one of it's in another country, I think. This young man is doing masonry work. And, if you see those guys work quick, it's whatever, get the cement or whatever it's called. I don't want to use the wrong terminology. Put it down, slap the brick on. Well, what he did, he put the brick on, he turned, and when he turned down to get the next brick, somebody behind him, a friend behind the wall, just takes that brick off. So he puts it back on, and then the person takes it back off. And this goes on for so long, and finally the guy just stands back like, I'm not making any progress, until he finds out his friend did it, and he had to kill him. No, I'm just kidding. But that would make... Have you ever seen the one of the guy shampooing his head? He's just a big muscular guy, and people keep pouring shampoo on his head. I've seen the size of that guy. I'm like, there's no way that would be me. I would maybe tell someone to do it, but I wouldn't take any of the credit ultimately. But, the history of the church is... Someone said this, in the history of the church, there's more of a problem with pessimism than with atheism. And I think that's interesting that there's a history that you see in the Old Testament of God's people, by God's power, making a huge step in the right direction, and then the enemy comes in and attacks. And the people are like, yeah, I'm good. We're done here. And we read it and go, oh, how could you give up so easy? It's like whenever the people of God were right on the border of Canaan, the promised land, and then those spies came back and said, there's giants in the land. It was like, okay, we're going back. And, Joshua and his men, no, we're gonna move forward here. Sometimes God's people focus on their weakness or weaknesses rather than their strengths. And that gets us looking away from God. It gets us looking down and being discouraged. And part of their discouragement was, in verse 11, the aggression of this enemy. This enemy wasn't given up easy. Judah's enemies are giving, again, physical threats, psychological warfare, and the builders are getting discouraged because now, as you read in verse 11, they're getting hints that there's going to be a surprise attack. No one wants a surprise attack. In verse 11, and our enemy said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. It's like you're working on a wall, and the next thing you know, you're in heaven. You're like, how did I get here? And, you got killed from behind. The people not working on the wall are frightened too because they're hearing about these surprise attacks. And they're scared for their loved ones. Verse 12, at that time the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, I love that, 10 times you must return to us. One writer says, it's so many words, you must return home, save yourselves and defend us. Did you hear that? You must return home, save yourself, and defend us. 8 more times. Over. And I think it wasn't exactly 10 times probably, but it was enough for the people working on the wall to be afraid for themselves and for their loved ones. And it's understandable that they would be anxious. Now, what does a good leader do here? He doesn't chew them out. Nehemiah, in the middle of this mess, what he does depends on his perspective. And that's what happens to us in the middle of life's storms. What is our perspective? I was reading this letter yesterday from a missionary who had gone into the jungles of New Guinea. And here's what he writes. A few years ago, but wow. Quote, man, he said, it's great to be in the thick of the fight, to draw the old devil's heaviest guns, to have him at you with depression and discouragement, slander, disease. Now me, if it was coming from some friends, I'm thinking, man, they're really being sarcastic. There's no sarcasm here. He doesn't waste time, the devil. He hits good and hard when a fellow is hitting him. You can always measure the weight of your blow by the one you get back. When you're on your back with fever and at your last ounce of strength, when some of your coverts backslide, when you learn that your most promising inquirers are only fooling, when your mail gets held up and some don't bother to answer your letters, is that the time to put on, I love this, your sadness suit? No, sir. That's the time to pull out the stops and shout, hallelujah. The old fellow's getting it in the neck and he's giving it back. And all of heaven is watching over the battlements, saying, will he stick it out? And as they see who is with us, as they see around us the unlimited reserves, the boundless resources, as they see the impossibility of failure with God, how disgusted and sad they must be when we run away. Glory to God. We're not going to run away. We're going to stand. That's an incredible perspective. The harder we're getting hit is because we're hitting hard. So, discouragement is understandable, but it's not the end of the story. We need to stand, and if we're being hit as a church by some way or another, and the devil has lots of creative ways to hit, we stand together and hit back. So the curtain now falls on the fourth scene. You can go get, Coke and popcorn and stuff like that. Then the bell rings, and you have to come in from your time off. Now we're going to see in scene 4 unity. In verses 13 through 20, we see this unity. Look at verse 13. Nehemiah is mobilizing this team by making sure the most vulnerable parts of the wall are protected by appointed guards. As an emergency measure, in verse 13, he writes this: so in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. He allowed the presence of their women and children to remind them who they were fighting for, and posted emergency troops at the lowest point of the wall so that the enemy could see Jerusalem had a militia and it was a force to be reckoned with. And then Nehemiah considers his options. Before any kind of public assembly, verse 14, he looked things over. He wasn't a guy that was going to make a hurried decision. And only after looking things over, verse 14 tells us that Nehemiah called together the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people. He calls them together. Why? Nehemiah now is going to share his faith. He's looked over the situation. He's got everyone together. Verse 14. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. He knows this public assembly has the effect, as he gathers everyone together, of showing their strength. But this public assembly also gives him the ability to tell people, to remind them of God's power and the holiness of their God and what they're fighting for. They're serving God, and this God has promised to meet their needs. He's not going to go back on his word. The circumstances have changed. The glitter and the initial thrill of doing this wall work is over with. The rubber's hit the road, but God hasn't changed. And the language that Nehemiah is using here by saying, don't be afraid, is not coincidental. Because if you read through the scriptures, you see that phrase stand out again and again. I think one of the first sermons I may have either done here years ago or here when I started in January was about what command is repeated the most in Scripture, and it is, don't fear, fear not. It appears 366 times in the Bible. As one writer said, one for every day of the year plus a leap year to throw in. So think back to Moses when he's talking to the children of Israel. When it seemed that they had been left for dead on the shores of the Red Sea. Exodus 14:13, Moses told the people, don't be afraid. Just stand where you are and watch the Lord rescue you. The Egyptians that you see today will never be seen again. That's powerful. Remember again when those scouts come back from looking at the promised land and people are like, there's no way we're going there because there's giants there. Moses again tells the people in Numbers 14:9, do not rebel against the Lord, and here it comes, Don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord, Yahweh, is with us. Don't be afraid of them. Sometimes later, when the people are on the very brink of entering the promised land, they're reminded by now of a dying Moses, as he says to them in Deuteronomy 31:6. We've heard these words before. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God will go ahead of you. He will neither fail or forsake you. And that's why Joshua, who was Moses' apprentice, faced a tough battle. And in Joshua 10:25, when he was in the midst of battle, said, don't ever be afraid or discouraged. Over and again, don't be afraid. Fear not. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord is going to do this to all your enemies. Now, we do read those accounts and think, how in the world can you doubt God? Again, the Red Sea one always blows me away, because that's pretty huge, watching the biggest army in the world just get drowned. And then you turn around a couple of days later and you're like, we want to go back. We're hungry. And, if you read through the accounts of Moses in the wilderness, you know from a human standpoint why he struck that rock when he was not told to strike it. And actually was the reason he wasn't allowed to see the promised land. But you're kind of like, I get it. He just was like, but again, remember, he's got that back and forth with God. And God says, okay, hey, I'm going to destroy them, and me and you start over. How many times do you think, okay, that's a good idea. Go ahead, get rid of me and you, God. And this is God saying it to you. And what does Moses say? No, Lord, don't. Don't let the people, the enemies of God, say that you destroyed your people. He pleads with God for these people who are driving him crazy. But that's just who we are through the centuries. God does something amazing in our life, and we think, if not say, I'll never doubt him again. And then kind of mark off the days before, like, I know I never doubt you again, God, but this seems bigger than it was before. But no matter how difficult the obstacles seem in our life, and really, no matter how difficult the obstacles are going to be, not might be, but will be for this church in the future, don't be afraid. Remember, the Lord is great. Remind each other that we're fighting for God, but we're fighting for each other, our families. You've heard soldiers say that when they're in the midst of battle, as much as they're defending their nation, they're not ultimately fighting for the nation. They're fighting for the guy to their right and their left. And that's how we have to think as Christians. When someone in our assembly falls, when someone maybe gives into a sin, instead of pronouncing judgment on them, don't let another Steve Green song from years ago, don't let another wounded soldier die. We need to be there for each other. So Nehemiah now is going to announce his plans. He's got this nightly emergency protection force, and he's greatly changed the enemy because the plot for any surprise attack was no longer a surprise. Now we go back to work, Nehemiah says, and he wants to make sure this workforce is ready to go, and he divides his teams into builders and soldiers. Verse 16, from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held their spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail or armor. And then verse 17 tells us that even the laborers who were carrying rubble away from the city, they were protected by armor. And with one hand, they held their weapon in the other hand. In verse 18, each of the builders were equipped with his sword strapped at his side while he built. So Nehemiah is preparing these people for the rough and tumble world. It doesn't necessarily mean he's a General Patton type motivator, but he's also a creative man. He's willing to think, as much as this phrase is overused, allow me, he's going to think outside the box now. Because in verse 20, we notice that in order to guarantee that the builders and laborers and residents are aware of potential danger, he develops this temporary warning system. A trumpeter stands by Nehemiah's side so that the troops could be quickly gathered together at the place where there was the most urgent need. Look at verse 20. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. How many have seen any of the Lord of the Rings movies? Any of all? Get a chance to. They're amazing. But, I think it's in the second one. I think it's the Battle of Isengard. My kids would be very disappointed if I missed any of those things. They love those movies. But when you just see this ungodly army built for destruction of, in that world, orcs, and then bigger creatures, and it's incredible. And all these people are just lined up, and the elves by this time have joined them. And you think, well, I don't think an elf joining me makes me feel good. In this world, the elves are really good with their bows and arrows. So they've got their artillery set up, and it just keeps coming, and wave after wave after wave. So that is kind of, in a sense, Nehemiah has got these folks ready, because you think it would be enough if they just had to build the wall. But do we have to face this too? But God is still going to show how great he is through this. So, scene 5. When the curtain comes up, it's a scene of sacrifice. Look at verses 21 through 23. Pay very close attention, friends. Even though Nehemiah makes careful plans to prepare for every possible emergency, his organizing ability would have been useless without the radical, sacrificial involvement of both his leaders and his people. The work continued on throughout every possible moment of the entire day. Verse 21, from the break of dawn till the stars came out. There were no times for siestas or naps. These people worked constantly. They weren't just doing it to enhance Jerusalem's architecture, to make it more beautiful. They wanted to strengthen Jerusalem's defenses against the kind of enemies that are threatening them now. Now, I know you've never heard of any countries having problems with building walls or people breaking through. I do think of that when I hear this, as much as we'll say another country. And a friend of mine, for instance, he pastored when I did in Maryland. He is a Messianic pastor. So he has a ministry specifically to Jewish people to introduce to them Jesus as the Messiah. And Scott's just a great pastor, brilliant guy. After pastoring at this church for so long, their church met in our church on Saturday. That's when they met. And so we got to be close friends. And he told me, I think God's really moving in me and the wife, and they had a huge family, but the kids that were still at home, to go to New Zealand. And I thought, Scott, you've watched Lord of the Rings too many times. You can't just walk over there, and it's not like that. There are no hobbits and things like that. But he really felt like God wanted him to have a ministry to a lot of they had a word for it. I'll call them backpackers, but people that come through and stay in the hostels, because New Zealand, their tourism shot up through the roof because of Lord of the Rings, but it's just beautiful. And a lot of Jewish people come through, and he and his wife believed God was leading them to kind of have a home where the people could come through and they could minister to them. Now, to even get a visa to work in New Zealand, it was amazing what he had to go through. And he said, New Zealand, along with other countries, guards its perimeters because they don't just want anyone coming in. So anytime I think about that, I think we, this is way off the subject, but we mistake the "give me your tired," which actually the French word that wasn't the Statue of Liberty. It's great, and all of the people that came over from all the countries, our ancestors came over, but they went to Ellis Island and they registered and they built America. But every country has to have, if not a physical wall, they have to have people at the borders. So politics aside, that's what's happening here. They want to preserve their country, and they don't want people coming in that are enemies of theirs, especially. Look at verse 23. So neither I nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. They must have smelled good. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. If you think about the story of the church over the centuries, it's built on incredible heroism and sacrificial service. People that literally gave their life for the cause of Christ. And here's another reminder of how important sacrifice is. I think sacrifice is unavoidable because personal sacrifice paves the way for God's miracles. And you have each heard your own stories of people that went from here to foreign lands. The great missionary movement that took place in the 1950s was all these boys coming home from World War II, going to Moody Bible Institute in Wheaton, revivals bringing out, and these guys are like, we're going back out. And you've got the very popular story of Jim Elliot and his crew that went to the Auca Indians. The Auca Indians, Auca in the original language was basically the word for death. No one could get near them. They killed everybody, including other tribes. And they wanted so badly for them to be able to come to Christ. And if you've ever read any of the books about that or seen the movies, just incredible stories. I had in my church in Florida a retired couple. They were ministers from one of the countries right near, I'm trying to think which one it was. I want to say Venezuela, but that isn't, or Argentina. I had two elders. They came on later after I was there for a bit, and they're retired missionaries. And they were both missionaries in Hispanic-speaking countries. These guys that, they're both with the Lord, I think, now, but the three of us get together and pray in the office. And Bob was so great. Oh, I love Bob. Bob would be sitting there next to Bill, and he'd be praying. He goes, pray for it. He goes, what's the English word for so-and-so? Okay, gotcha. And they're starting to speak in tongues, but the problem is they can translate for each other because it's, Espanol. But I'll never forget Bob Clark's wife, Miriam. She was our pianist. Had to be then in her mid-70s. I was telling her about a quote I love from Elizabeth Elliot, who, if you know, that was Jim's wife, and all their husbands were killed by the Auca Indians. Elizabeth went back to minister to those people, and they came to Christ. And she was writing a book or something on forgiveness, literally surrounded by some of the people who were part of killing her husband. So I was telling Miriam about this quote from Elizabeth Elliot. She said, "Oh, you mean Betty?" "Yeah, I was good friends with Betty." I'm like, "Oh, Betty, wow." Well, I know Billy Graham. No, I'm just kidding, I didn't. But as they were coming onto the field as youngsters, Elizabeth Elliot and some of those people that were in that were coming off the field. But that, just story after story of people, they didn't even have to die, but they were willing to go anywhere to share the gospel. Now the way our country is, people are coming from other countries to share it here, because we are post-Christian or pre-Christian, but we're not the nation we were back in those days for sure. So I want to tell you a true story to close things up here. 1908, there was an Irish explorer named Ernest Shackleton, and he was leading an Antarctic expedition, and they were trying to reach the South Pole. They came closer than anyone had before them, but they got about 97 miles short of the pole, and they had to turn back. And in his diary, Shackleton is telling about a time when they had very limited food left. It was almost all gone. There was one last ration for each person. And this was something called a hardtack. Anybody ever heard of that? It's a sort of dried biscuit. And he gave each man their last hardtack, their last little biscuit. That's all they had. So some of the men took snow and melted it and made tea to go along with their biscuit. The British. Others, however, packed the hardtack in their food sacks, saving them for that last moment of hungry desperation. So the fire was built up, and the men were weary and exhausted, and they all climbed into their sleeping bags to face a restless night of sleep, tossing and turning. Shackleton said that he was almost asleep when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed one of his most trusted men sitting up in his bag and looking about to see if anybody else was watching. So Shackleton's heart, he said, sank within me as I watched this incredible man begin to reach toward the food sack of the man next to him. And Shackleton watched as the man opened the food sack and took his own hardtack and put it in the other guy's sack. That's sacrifice. The truth is, what I want every one of us to hear tonight, every person in this church to take with them, not only out of this building tonight, but to our graves, that ministry is giving when we feel like keeping. Ministry is praying for others when you need to be prayed for. Ministry is feeding others when your soul is hungry. Ministry is living truth before people even when you can't see any results. Ministry is hurting with other people even when your own hurt can't be spoken. Ministry is keeping your word even when it's not convenient. Being faithful when your flesh wants to run away. That's the spirit I hope to see continue here. And I want to hear about from Putman Baptist Church. And I admit that it's a spirit that's not easy to develop and maintain. None of us are going to pull it off perfectly. But we do know that if we want to be able to make an impact on our community and throughout the world, it has to start here with us. We can't depend on another church to do it. We have to, especially as God brings a new minister, join hands and hearts and say, let's reach the lost in this place. Let's find those who have not been to church since they were little and invite them back in, and let this be a place where they are so welcomed. I believe that spirit's here, and I just want to hear about it continuing and hearing great things. Let's pray. God, we are so thankful for the book of Nehemiah.